All right, hello everyone. It is just past 9 p.m. here in Israel, just past 2 p.m. on the US East Coast, and we are starting this week's special Zoom briefing for Haaretz readers and subscribers about the results of the US election and the implications for Israel and the Middle East. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been just over a week since the November 3rd election in the United States, and the results are in, even if some people are refusing to accept them for now. Joe Biden won at least 270 electoral votes and likely at the end of all the counting more than 300. Republicans made gains in the House of Representatives and the Senate is still up for grabs. Donald Trump has 70 more days exactly to his term in office before he will have to vacate the White House on January 20th and leave it to the president-elect of the United States, Joe Biden. What will these results mean for Israel and the Middle East? What can President Trump still do in our part of the world before he's out the door? And what should Israel expect from the incoming Biden administration? We're going to discuss all of these questions, urgent questions, I should say, and more with Amos Harel, Senior Haaretz defense analyst, and Judy Maltz, our veteran Jewish world correspondent who is transitioning these days to her next role as the diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz. Amos and Judy, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Amir Tibon, and I just want to remind our viewers that you can submit questions to Amos and Judy via the chat button on your screen. I will be reading those questions as we move along and presenting at least some of them to Amos and Judy at the end of the session, and they will answer. So again, thank you everyone for being with us. We have a nice crowd, and let's begin. Amos, I want to start with you. We have seen with past US administrations that sometimes the transition period between one administration and the next is actually a period when some big decisions are made regarding the Middle East. Reagan recognized the PLO only after the 1988 elections, really on the way to the end of his second term. Obama abstained at the UN Security Council vote on settlements in December 2016, after Trump had already been declared the winner of that year's election. Do you sense that we should also expect some big moves in the Middle East by the Trump administration in the next 2 months?
Hi, Amir. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I think it's possible. I think even more so than in the past. I think we should bear in mind what's going on in Washington right now. As you've mentioned, we have a president who's refusing to concede. We've just watched the Monday night massacre at the Pentagon. And I think there's a sort of messianic atmosphere around the White House that could affect both domestically, but also foreign policy issues. We should also note 2 visits, one that already happened. Elliot Abrams, the administration's special envoy on the Iran issue, was here this week. He's traveling through the Middle East. He met with Netanyahu and with the IDF's top brass. He also had a meeting with journalists, which I attended. And more importantly, perhaps next week, it's Secretary Pompeo, who's about to arrive here, the same man who just explained yesterday that the only transition expected in Washington is between the first Trump administration and the second. So why do they come here at these COVID times? Abrams told us that one of the goals of his visit was strengthening the sanctions. He said that this was part of an ongoing plan. It had nothing to do with the results of the elections. Then again, when he discussed the elections, he said something along the lines of what the Trump administration is saying right now. He said it's not for CNN or Fox to call the winner. We'll have to wait for the American people and so on. But it was quite clear from his talk with us that they're trying to have more to change more of the facts on the ground, so to speak, in order to make it harder for the next administration to reach a policy of its own regarding Iran, especially something that we'll probably talk more about later, the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran. As everyone remembers, Trump decided to pull out of the agreement in 2018. I think the general assumption in Washington is that more pressure right now, the maximum pressure campaign, would put Tehran in a tight spot and would force it to give more concessions if there are discussions in the future. There's also this slight possibility that something more sinister may be going on. The New York Times reported earlier this week that Trump is thinking of going out with a bang, some kind of military strike against Iran or Venezuela. Personally, I'd prefer it would be against Venezuela and not around here. Netanyahu no longer has a deep ideological feeling about almost anything, I think, except for the Iran issue. Everything else we've seen, the annexation, which we discussed in the past, we've seen him give it away very, very easily in order to move ahead with the Emirates and Bahrain. His only goal right now is political survival. And this is a goal that he needs to achieve in order to get out of his legal problems. But Iran is the exception. And the fear is, as I said, it's quite slight, but the fear is that somehow this messianic atmosphere around the White House, combined with what's going on with Netanyahu, may lead to some trouble between November and January. I don't see a big chance of this happening. We have to consider the weather as well. Traditionally, it's thought that somewhere between November and April, it's almost impossible to strike in Iran, but we should mention that as well. On a final note regarding this, I think that Netanyahu would do much better for himself and for the Israeli people if he's able to persuade President Trump to move ahead with the vaccines. That's much more important and much more urgent for everybody right now. As you know, Israel did not sign a contract with Pfizer. If Netanyahu can achieve that, and he's already announced this evening that he's had talks with the general manager of Pfizer and so on, this may help the Israeli people, but it may also help his chances of winning the next elections.
So if we do see any kind of dramatic activity between now and January, most likely in the Iranian arena.
Either Iran or Venezuela, as I said.
Yeah, I share your hope almost that it will be in Venezuela. Judy, I want to turn to you. What is the general sentiment in Israel these days regarding the results of the election? Most world leaders have congratulated President-elect Biden for his victory. How has Prime Minister Netanyahu handled this issue so far?
Well, it was actually quite strange. It took Netanyahu 12 hours to acknowledge the election results and to congratulate Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, long after many world leaders had. And even then, he refrained from saying explicitly that Biden had actually won the election. Look, I haven't conducted a poll about it, but I would assume that for most Israelis, it was kind of embarrassing that their leader had waited that long. True, Trump was a very good president, in fact, a great president for Netanyahu. He really delivered the goods for Netanyahu when Netanyahu needed it, like right before elections in Israel. And we had 3 of those in the past year and a half. So now Netanyahu really does owe Trump big time. And it isn't that surprising then that he chose to wait before congratulating Biden and Harris. Trump can still do lots of things until January, as Amos was just saying. And the last thing Netanyahu needs is to get on Trump's bad side right now when Trump seems to be rather unhinged. So you can be 100% sure that had Trump won the election, Netanyahu would have been the first or one of the first world leaders to pick up the phone and congratulate him. Let's not forget that ever since he tried to undermine Barack Obama over the Iranian nuclear deal, Netanyahu has pretty much alienated the Democratic Party. And while he may indeed have a strong friendship with Biden that goes back 40 years, and he did mention this in the congratulatory message, he has turned Israel into a partisan issue in Washington in recent years. And that's not a good thing when it's the guy from the other party who wins the election. Another thing to bear in mind is that Netanyahu may have congratulated Biden, but the photo on the top of his official Twitter page is still one of him and Donald Trump. And it will be very interesting to see how long it takes before he changes it.
Maybe when the Electoral College convenes, maybe then.
Maybe. So, and now as far as the general public in Israel is concerned, all the polls that were done before the election showed that an overwhelming majority of Israelis preferred Trump to Biden. Netanyahu has said many times in recent years that Trump was the best friend in the White House that Israel ever had. And apparently that message did hit home with many Israelis. Most Israelis, it would seem, have a bit of a problem, though, differentiating between what's good for Israel and what's good for Netanyahu, or even between what's good for Israelis in general and what's good for the settlers, who make up just a tiny percent of the population. And let's not forget that Trump was willing to recognize Israeli sovereignty over all the West Bank settlements, the first US president willing to do that, which is why the right wing in Israel loved him so much. These surveys I was just mentioning show that somewhere around 70%, if not more, of Israelis were rooting for Trump. That's much, much higher than the percentage who supported Netanyahu in the recent elections, and much, much, much higher than the percentage who support annexation. I think a couple months ago, there were surveys showing that very few, very, very small percentage of the public was really interested in annexation at all. We have much more pressing problems in this country.
Like Amos said, the vaccine right now is a bigger priority than anything else.
Exactly. So why so many would support Trump over Biden when Biden has long been known as one of the most pro-Israel Democrats? Just doesn't make sense to me.
And Amos, Netanyahu, while he did, for all these last 4 years indicate the fond relationship with Trump, we have seen signs of somewhat of a U-turn in the last, I would even say 48 hours, right? He gave a speech in the Knesset yesterday and said, I was shocked to read, there is no difference between Democrats and Republicans. Where does that come from?
That's the first time we've ever heard of this. Look, Judy has mentioned that. There's been a lot of bad blood between Netanyahu and the Democratic Party during all of the previous decade. It began under Obama. Immediately after Obama came into office, the Cairo speech and so on, later on freezing the settlements, and of course, the whole debate about the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran. The height of this was Netanyahu actually going to Congress and speaking against Obama, receiving a standing ovation from the Republicans and so on. But this made Obama very, very angry. So I think the Democrats remember all that, and I think that those arguments are still in the air, so to speak. And they felt that he was extremely identified with Trump. Of course, Trump, this is the way Trump handles himself, and those leaders who were on his good side very early realized that they needed to grovel all the time. This is why we have Trump Heights in the Golan Heights. It's nothing. There's nothing there. It's just, it looks like a scenery from some movie, but it was still, Netanyahu did that intentionally in order to flatter Trump's huge ego. And I think in the end, Biden will find a time to settle the score with Netanyahu, but I don't think that it will happen immediately. He won't boycott him. He will work with him. They know each other for years. But the sentiment, the bad feeling among many Democrats towards Netanyahu remains. I don't think they'll ever forget what happened during the last 4 years or the previous term, at least Obama's second term, especially when it came to the debate about Iran.
But I also want to ask you about the issue almost of, personalities aside, about policy. When you talk to your sources in the Israeli security establishment, in the intelligence agencies, do they expect a Biden administration to be Obama 2.0, or do they expect a more moderate, centrist Democratic administration in line with Biden's own politics as a moderate Democrat?
I think it's going to be a mixture of both, but probably more more of the second option. Biden does not hide his intention to go back to the nuclear agreement with Iran. But I would assume, and this is what I hear again from Israeli sources, that they believe that both Biden and his close advisors are aware of the mistakes that were made on the road to the agreement that was signed by the Obama administration in 2015. So I think there will be some willingness to listen to some of the Israeli criticism, whether it's about Israel's demands for more surveillance, about the possible military dimensions of the Iranian nuclear plan, whether it's about the sunset clauses and the how long will the agreement remain in place, and whether it's about two very important issues that were left out completely of the original agreement. One of them is Iran's involvement all over the Middle East, contributing to terrorism against Israel and against other Arab regimes in the Middle East, all across the Middle East. And the second very important issue is Iran's weapons plan, specifically Iran's rockets and missiles programs, which were not dealt with intentionally by the Obama administration. The general feeling in Washington at that time was that this could not be addressed at the first agreement, and that they needed to move forward by any means necessary. But I think by now, I would assume that Biden and the people around him are aware of those mistakes and are aware of the criticism, which does not only come from Israel, but is also shared by Riyadh and by other capitals in the region. So there will probably be more openness to debate about that. This is not Obama again. This is something slightly different.
Judy, one thing that we wrote about a lot during the Trump years here at Haaretz was the strong influence of evangelical Christians and ultra-Orthodox Jews on his administration, especially on issues related to Israel. Who do we expect will be the whisperers who will have the ears of the next administration once Biden comes into the White House?
I would assume it would be the type of Jewish organizations and movements that have always been affiliated with the Democratic Party. Case in point would be J Street, the progressive Jewish lobby that calls itself pro-peace and pro-Israel and strongly supports the two-state solution. Over the years, Biden has appeared at quite a few of their events, and J Street has also fundraised for him in the recent campaign. It's pretty clear that they will have his ear. And so too, I assume, will the non-Orthodox movements, especially the Reform movement, which is the biggest Jewish movement in the United States and shares many of the progressive values of the Democratic Party, and also known to be on very good terms with Joe Biden. While AIPAC, the big pro-Israel lobby, is more to the right of J Street, Biden has been a regular at their events for years, and I'm pretty sure he will continue to maintain very good ties with them. I'm not so sure he will have great ties with some of the other Jewish organizations that are more to the left. I'm thinking of If Not Now, the sort of organizations that were trying to get him and other Democratic candidates to condition future Israeli aid on Israel withdrawing from the West Bank and helping the Palestinians more. I'm not sure they will have that much contact with him or be able to influence him as much, because he's still very mainstream for a Democrat. Now, with progressive Jewish groups regaining access to the White House, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out vis-a-vis their relationship with Israel. You remember the Kotel deal, right? The Western Wall deal from a few years ago. That was the agreement that was supposed to have given the reform and conservative movements equal status at the Western Wall. It was a very, very important agreement for them, and it was pushed through the Netanyahu government in early 2016, while Barack Obama was still US president. In other words, at a time when members of the progressive Jewish movements, like the conservative and reform movements, had someone who listened to them in the White House. The Kotel deal was scrapped a year and a half later, before it had ever been implemented. And that was after Netanyahu came under huge pressure from his ultra-Orthodox coalition partners to end the deal. But let's not forget that by then, Trump was president of the United States. In other words, the reform and conservative movements had by then lost their influence in the White House. I'm not sure that that wasn't a factor as well in Netanyahu's decision to trash the Kotel deal. So this could be, again, very good news for the reform and conservative movements.
Thank you, Judy. I just want to say to everyone who is joining us now, and we are joined by more and more people via Zoom, via Facebook Live, This is a special Haaretz briefing about the US elections and the implications for Israel and the Middle East. We have our senior defense analyst, Amos Harel, and our incoming diplomatic correspondent, Judy Maltz. And we are taking questions, so please do send questions through the chat button, and Judy and Amos will answer them as we reach the end of the hour. Amos, we've spoken a lot about the view here in Israel. I want to try to take you on a quick regional tour and ask you, how are the results of this election being viewed in other capitals, Tehran, Riyadh, in the United Arab Emirates? What is kind of like the reactions we're seeing more broadly in the region?
Let's begin with Iran. It's quite clear that the Iranians are happy. Trump was tough towards them, and many times he acted unexpectedly. He surprised them by how quickly he decided to leave the nuclear agreement, to pull out of it, and even more so by something that he did this January. It's hard to remember, that was BC, before COVID, but the decision to assassinate General Qasem Soleimani in Iraq was quite a surprise, and this is something that they never believed the Americans would dare to do. And this whole policy of maximum pressure, the sanctions, it did not break the Iranians' spirit, but it did put the Iranian economy in a very, very tight situation. They're facing very, very hard times, and of course they did not like Trump for that. We should also note that having a scenario in which Trump would have won a second term, it's quite clear that he would have returned to negotiations with the Iranians. He declared that publicly. And there was always a chance, something that Netanyahu was quite worried about, although he never said that publicly, that Trump would do another North Korea in Iran, meaning some kind of compromise with a lot of concessions, and then quickly declaring that this was the best deal in the world. And of course, both Netanyahu and MBS would have had to praise him for that. So this is something that Netanyahu was feared. Biden is another story. The Iranians know that there will be negotiations. We don't know how tough the Americans would be. They're already presenting all kinds of prior conditions, like demanding that the sanctions would be lifted before they go into negotiations and so on. I think that things would start quite slowly, probably around February. In June, we have to mention that there are elections to the presidency in Iran. And I think even only after that, when it is clear what happens to the domestic power struggles in Tehran, there will be a clearer road ahead for the nuclear negotiations. We should also note the fact that the strongest and the most important man in Iran, which is a spiritual leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, he's not getting any younger. He's 81, and there are all kinds of reports about his health. This may affect their decisions as well. Moving to other nations in the region, look, most of the conservative Sunni states were quite pro-Trump, whether it's General Sisi, who had in Egypt, who had a very hard time with the Obama administration and was almost declared as the brutal leader of a military coup. And it was only Israeli intervention at that time that prevented the Obama administration from declaring that. So there was bad blood with the Democrats there. I don't think that Sisi is happy in any way for the fact that Biden has been elected. Regarding other countries, we saw that they acted quite in a quite similar way to what Netanyahu did. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so on, they were not quick to congratulate Biden on his victory, and they were very, very, they were careful with their language, praising him and so on. It was done in all kinds of obscure terms in order not to offend the president. I don't think they're very, very happy. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia knows that it has huge influence in Washington because of its money, and the same goes for the Emirates. So there's no fear here. They probably would have preferred Trump to learn to live with Biden as well.
And Judy, what does it mean for the future of the relationship between Israelis and American Jews that Biden, according to exit polls in the US, received around 75% of the Jewish vote, while most Israeli Jews, like you mentioned earlier, are kind of sad that Trump will be leaving the White House?
Well, I said that's what the polls show. I'm not sure I believe that. I'm not seeing people walking around the street sad these days. But then again, it's
certainly not in Tel Aviv, maybe in Jerusalem more. Yeah.
Anyway, it's hard with masks on to see how people are actually feeling these days. I don't think they're really very sad. Nobody's mourning. even the settlers who loved Trump, they're a little angry with him because, you know, in the end, he was in favor of a two-state solution or some form of one. So, but yeah, maybe they did prefer, many Israelis did prefer to see Trump win. I think they'll get over it. They've dealt with Democratic presidents before. And among Democrats, I think there's pretty much a consensus that Biden is probably the best deal they're going to get these days. And going back to what I said before, the fact that the candidate that American Jews so overwhelmingly supported won is sure to have repercussions in Jerusalem. Under Trump, you could have said that most American Jews were in the opposition. And that allowed the Israeli government, led by Netanyahu, to pretty much disregard them and concentrate its outreach efforts instead on the evangelical community, which was much more plugged into the White House over the past 4 years. But now you could say that American Jews are back in power with the man they overwhelmingly supported headed to the White House. The government of Israel will therefore have to start treating them with a bit more respect. And I'll give you one concrete example, something that we've written about in the past few weeks. There's this whole big controversy going on now over the question of who will head Yad Vashem, which is of course a very important institution, not only for Israel, but for world Jewry. Now, Netanyahu's candidate is a guy named Effie Eitam. I'm not sure that many diaspora Jews have heard of him, but he is a former politician and military commander with a very problematic record, and who he has said pretty awful things about the Arab population. This nomination is not going down well with many American Jews and many more progressive Israelis as well. And even the ADL last week issued a statement against it. And this is something very, very rare for the ADL to do. So I wouldn't be surprised if Netanyahu had a change of heart now about this nomination because of the regime change in America and the new power that more progressive Jewish forces have now gained.
It will be interesting to follow this dynamic, definitely in the next few months. Amos, I want to ask you something that has to do more with the process in the United States. One of the most disturbing things that we've seen in the aftermath of the election has been Trump's refusal to accept the results. What impact does it have on Israel, as well as on other countries in the region, when this kind of behavior is displayed by the man who is supposed to be the leader of the free and democratic world?
There should be an impact, but I'd like to go back a little to 2016. Immediately after Trump's victory then, you could see its effect, the Trump effect, if you'd like, on Israel and on other countries as well. A few weeks after Trump's victory, Netanyahu began speaking of fake news. You remember that, Amir? He never mentioned anything like that before.
It was new, yeah.
He began picking on journalists personally and attacking them on personal terms, something that he never did before, although he had a volatile and sometimes hostile relationship with many, many media organizations and journalists all over his years in politics. So he took some pages from Trump's playbook very, very early. He was even quoted in December 2016 as saying to his advisors, "Be like Trump." So he just changed some of his style following Trump. And I think that autocrats or strongmen all over the region and perhaps in other areas in the world were taking those pages from the Trump playbook at that time and were quite happy about Trump being elected. So if we go back to what's happening right now, I think that the fact that even inside Israel and to some in the Israeli media as well, when you hear them repeating all those very ridiculous conspiracy theories about the elections being stolen and so on, this worries me to a point. It also shows again that people are having a hard time making the differentiation between actual journalism and fake news. And probably not only is this going to continue in regards to American politics, if in fact we're going to elections within a few months, we'll probably see more and more of that in Israeli elections as well. There were signs in the last round of elections.
Yeah, we did have already in the previous election, Netanyahu talking about the attempts to steal the election, about forgeries and the massive fraud in the Arab sector, which of course was never proven, there was never any evidence to
Yeah,
support
but
it.
now Trump is setting an example on a much larger scale,
Yes.
and we'll probably see attempts to copy that in Israel and other countries as well.
Yeah, the good news I would say is that maybe the media here could see what is happening in the American media, how they are combating these conspiracy theories.
We'll have to see about that, Amir.
Yeah, and maybe learn a lesson from that. Judy, one detail that many Haaretz readers don't know about you is that apart from your expertise in covering the Jewish world, you are also our in-house expert on the wonderful state of Pennsylvania, where you lived for 8 years, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
I do want to ask you a more political American question. Were you surprised to see that Joe Biden was able to bring it back to the blue wall after Hillary Clinton lost it to Donald Trump 4 years ago?
Well, I wasn't so much surprised because Pennsylvania traditionally was a Democratic state. It was kind of a fluke that it went to Trump in the last election, but I was definitely relieved by what happened. And Pennsylvania, as you say, is a wonderful state, but it's a lot different from what most people think. Most people tend to lump it together with the Eastern Seaboard states, even though it's not actually on the coast. But it's actually much more Midwest in culture than it is East Coast. Or as James Carville once famously said, it's Philadelphia on one side, Pittsburgh on the other, and Alabama in between. By the way, in that Alabama part, there's one blue bubble. If you were looking at the maps that were on TV for right after the election for a few days, you'd see this one blue bubble in the middle of Pennsylvania. That's where I lived for those 8 years. And it's aptly called Center County because it's, exactly in the middle of the state. So yes, once you get out of those big cities, it's very, very rural in Pennsylvania. And the people who live in these rural parts of the state tend to be very conservative and very religious Christians. Many of them, I learned, have never seen a Jew in their life until they met me, of course. So it makes sense that Trump would do well there, much better than he did in nearby New York and New Jersey. And just so you know, outside Philly and Pittsburgh, there are more cows than Jews. So these rural parts are really quite beautiful. And we discussed this, gorgeous at this time of the year. But if you traveled around there in recent weeks, you will probably only have seen Trump signs outside people's houses, no Biden signs at all.
So Biden's strengths mostly came from the cities and the suburbs around them.
Well, the Democrats have always done well in the cities, Philly, Pittsburgh, and the suburbs around them. I think what flipped Pennsylvania this time, our colleague Chemi Shalev did this really wonderful mathematical analysis showing how actually Biden owes his victory to the Jews of Pennsylvania. He showed that if the Jews hadn't voted for Biden, he wouldn't have won Pennsylvania. But the Jews always vote Democrat in Pennsylvania and in most of the big cities. What flipped Pennsylvania this time was Erie County. That had traditionally been a Democratic county. It went to Trump in 2016 and flipped back this time. And it's working class, blue collar. And one of the theories I heard is that, these are really traditional folks who couldn't bring themselves to vote for a woman last time. So Biden was easier for them to vote for.
Amos, I want to ask you on the same issue of the impacts from American politics to Israeli politics. You described very well what happened after Trump won in 2016. Could there be some kind of a reverse effect if in 2 months Israelis see the more, I would say, polite, gentle, moderate Joe Biden, being sworn in as president after a campaign where he spoke about the soul of the nation? and after an acceptance, a victory speech over the weekend where he tried to reach out to Trump voters and said, I know what it means to lose. I want to build bridges to you. Do you think that could have, the kind of reverse impact on our politics, or have we gone so much into the Trump territory that it's too late?
Look, I'd love to say that this was a possibility. I think that the animosity here and the divisiveness around Netanyahu, Netanyahu's persona more than anything else. The Israeli public is divided into two halves. Probably a bigger part is pro-Netanyahu still, but the whole discussion here is no longer ideological. Mostly it's about whether you praise Netanyahu and worship him or whether you detest him and you want him out. This is the main issue. So it's hard to believe that this would magically change all of a sudden because there's a nicer, more polite man probably leading America and then settling in the White House in 2 months' time. But we did see one sign of this. We saw the leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, a few days ago speaking at the Knesset. And he attacked personally one of the Likud backbenchers who suddenly became a minister because he was so close to Netanyahu and because he was one of Netanyahu's most lethal envoys to the press. This is a minister called Dudi Amsalem. And he talks time after time at the Knesset, spoke recently, and that was very, very aggressive, sometimes even ugly, lots of personal attacks, sometimes using swearing in some of these speeches and so on. And suddenly Lapid turned to him and said, listen, Dudi, why do you do this? And it was very, very clear that he was actually taking, again, a page from Biden's playbook. Why do you think that this is necessary? Why do you think that people would believe you if you attack us in such a vicious and ugly way? And suddenly, the cameras turned to Amsalem, and he was shocked. He didn't see this coming in any kind of way. So there are some kind of expectations, and of course, that the video went viral among in Israeli social networks and so on. I don't think it will change the matter here. It will change the basic rules of engagement, so to speak. As long as Netanyahu is the main issue here, and as long as the atmosphere around Netanyahu is so toxic, I don't think that there will be a huge change in the way Israeli politics are done, at least in recent times.
And then I also want to ask you, Amos, what about the Palestinians? We've barely mentioned them in this discussion tonight.
We tend to stop mentioning them in recent debates here, in recent discussions. Look, it's quite clear that they're happy about Biden. Abbas was one of the first leaders in the region, I think in the world, to congratulate him. As you remember, Abbas cut all ties with Washington a few years back because he was blaming Trump even before the so-called deal of the century was presented. He was blaming Trump for being too coordinated with Netanyahu and working for the Israelis and so on. So it's quite clear that Abbas will look for a way to resume relationship with Washington once Biden is sworn in, and perhaps make some slight steps towards Israel. You know that both the civilian and defense cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority has been cut off by the Palestinians a few months back because of all kinds of arguments. So this would probably change. I don't think that we will see the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians resume very, very quickly. It's not the top priority for the Biden administration. And then again, Abbas himself is turning this next week, I think this Sunday, he's turning 85. Assuming that somebody at this age would be willing to give up some of his principles and make concessions to the Israelis, I don't find this very, very likely.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Judy, I want to ask you another question regarding the evangelical Christian support for Israel that came through so strong for Israel during the Trump years. Do you see a scenario where Netanyahu, instead of now making amends with the Democrats, maybe doubles down on their support and tries to use it in opposition against the Biden administration?
What would that serve him, really? Well, why would he do that?
I mean, it would be kind of like what we saw under the Obama years when he was in a very combative approach against a Democratic president.
I don't know. What's interesting, I think I saw some exit poll yesterday. It looks like actually Trump lost quite a bit of support among evangelicals who voted against him this time, the main reason being his personality, which we were just talking about, his lack of statesmanship. So, you know, even Trump is not doing that well with him, or as well as he used to be doing with him. So I don't see how they can help Netanyahu now, or how they could help him more than they were with the new administration in power.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned. I also saw this exit poll that that showed that he still won the evangelical vote, but by less than in 16. And another interesting headline I saw today was Robert Jeffries, who was the pastor, evangelical pastor from Texas, who prayed at the ceremony where they opened the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem in 2018. Gave this prayer, and as a big Trump supporter, he gave an interview to a local newspaper in Texas and said, I love President Trump, but he needs to concede the election. Biden is the president-elect, and we all need to move on, which I found very surprising that Robert Jeffries would say that before 90% of the Republican senators. But maybe that shows, again, an indication of some movement in the evangelical world.
Well, you know, I get all these evangelical newsletters, so I see they're all kind of confused because they say, well, isn't God supposed to bless those who bless Israel? So how can it be that the person who blessed Israel more than anyone else, i.e. Donald Trump, has lost this election, or appears to have lost this election? And they're trying to figure out some explanation for that now.
That's an interesting question. Amos, when we look back at the legacy of the Trump administration, these 4 years with Israel, overall, and this is something that I already see some people have asked us, and I'm not officially transitioning to the Q&A stage, but it is an interesting question. Overall, do you think it will be remembered, 10 years from now as a positive record, or maybe some things that we did not, that made headlines at the time, but we didn't really, we're not as celebrated as the embassy, like the withdrawal from Syria will loom larger?
Look, probably the answer depends on your politics, of course, and your ideology. I think right-wing Israelis would remain, their identification and their sympathy for Trump would remain. But a lot of these gestures are exactly that, gestures, and maybe empty ones as well. Recognizing Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights, or moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and so on. This was cause for celebration, not only among right-wing Israelis. Many people on the political center appreciated that as well. I think in the long run, the discussion would be different. One part of the discussion would go to strategic issues in the region. Was he really good against Iran? Did this contribute much? How did he act on Syria and Iraq? What about him? I think the most positive thing to have happened under Trump in the region, of course, is this normalization between Israel and some of the Sunni states. And I think possibly this would have moved even more forward if Trump would have won, with Saudi Arabia, perhaps with other relatively conservative or moderate Sunni states. So this is important. And this is, I think, if you're trying to count pros and cons, this is the pro side. I think this is the most helpful thing that Trump actually did. And perhaps even I'll say something that is quite different from the Haaretz editorial line. Perhaps he helped the Palestinians overcome some of their illusions about what they could get out of Israel by squeezing Israel and the US and using violence and so on. So this may be on the helpful side. I think on the negative side, on the con side, the most important issue to me is not strategic, it's a matter of conduct. The way Trump behaved, the non-presidential leadership that he presented to the world in the last few years. Now, some of his followers were saying, okay, this is good. He fought against the political swamp. He spoke the truth to power and so on. I don't think that's the case. I think that there's this old British saying of this isn't done. I think that's extremely important, and it's no longer part of the discussion. But maybe if we forget about Trump a little, and maybe if we can, move ahead with President Biden, I think maybe there's a chance that things will get more normal so to speak, over that. I think this is much more important than anything else. This is a Trump legacy, and here it's very, in my view, very, very negative.
Okay, so we will now move officially to questions from our viewers, and we have a lot of them. There is still time to ask more questions through the chat if you're interested, so feel free to do that. Judy, I'll take the first question to you, and it's kind of similar to what I just asked Amos. Does the panel believe that President Trump overall was good for Israel? So we had Amos refer to that. I want to hear your take now.
You know, good for Israel is such a ambivalent term in a way, because what do we mean when we say good for Israel? Good for the entire country, good for the Israeli government, good for Netanyahu, good for the Orthodox, good for the right-wingers, good for the settlers. So it's very, you know, certainly for Netanyahu, he was good, you know, certainly for the Israeli settlers, he was better than any president they had beforehand. Was he good for most Israelis? Do most Israelis improve their life in any way that the embassy was moved to Jerusalem? That even those who live in the Golan Heights, has their life been improved by the fact that the Americans recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights? I mean, these were very declarative things in a way. I don't think they really helped Israel. I think most Israelis, you know, what do they care about? What concerns the, you know, the center in this country? You know, the people who have to send their kids to the army. Has their lives gotten better? Are they less concerned when they go to sleep at night about their children in the army? No.
Yeah, that is a good point. Speaking of, you know, security issues and sending children to the army, a question for you, Amos. Does Trump's massive arms deal with the United Arab Emirates endanger Israel's security in any way? Will it cause an arms race in the Middle East?
Okay, this is going back to the question of QME, qualitative military edge. A short explanation about that. This is a long-time principle, beginning with the Johnson and Nixon administrations, that later on became a law passed by Congress. And this actually says that the United States will take care of maintaining Israel's military edge over its neighbors. It doesn't say whether these neighbors are friends or enemies, or perhaps frenemies. Of course, what the law states is that the president would have to have discussions with Israeli officials before moving ahead with potential deals. There was a lot of fuss, and I think we may have discussed this in a previous panel, if I'm not mistaken. There was a lot of fuss about what Israel knew and when about this. There's a domestic debate here and a lot of criticism regarding Netanyahu, because the feeling, at least among the people who are against him politically, is that he too easily agreed to the deal. This is a huge deal. It was just published today that this is the third biggest deal money-wise in the US history of selling of weapons. This is not good news for Israel. I don't think that the UAE is in any kind of a direct threat to Israel. It's too far away. And the current regime, at least, is very, very friendly towards us. So there are joint strategic interests and so on. The potential danger here, I think there are two dangers. One is that something that we don't expect may happen in the future. A regime change, a pro-Iranian regime or something like that, or perhaps something along the lines of Al-Qaeda, ISIS getting control of the Gulf states and so on. That this would be bad news for Israel, of course. And I think the more likely scenario is that this would be the beginning of a huge arms race. And once you broke the taboo, once you decided to sell all of these very, very sophisticated platforms, first and foremost, the F-35 fighter planes, to the UAE, I think, especially if Trump would have continued, there would have been no obstacle to sell those weapons later on to Saudi Arabia, more dangerous, I think, than the UAE, potentially dangerous to Israel, to Egypt, which is our friend and neighbor, but again, Israel does not want Egypt to have those weapons, and to Qatar as well. And all those countries are waiting in line because all of these leaders, and all of them are dictators, we have to remember, want those very, very modern weapons. So I think in the long run, I don't see any immediate danger. And I think it was probably worth it for Israel in order to sign this very, very important normalization agreement. But there's a potentially dangerous scenario here where, as the question is mentioned, where there's an arms race over this, and this is no good for Israel, of course.
Thank you. A question I want to refer to you, Judy, and it goes like this: American support for Israel has been as strong as it has because of American Jewish pressure. Now, except for a handful of Orthodox, virtually all American Jews voted for Biden. What does that mean in the long term for the prospect of American Jewish support for Israel and its impact on American politics?
Oh, I think all the polls we've seen show that still the vast majority of American Jews are still overwhelmingly support Israel and its right to exist, and they may take issues with this policy or that policy of the Israeli government, but overall, they are still firmly behind Israel. And I don't think there is any reason for Israelis to fear that just because a Democratic president was elected and he may not have been the preferred choice of most Israelis, certainly not the prime minister, that this will in any way change the amount of support among the American Jewish community. It's very basic, fundamental support.
Amos, a question to you about Iran. What modifications do you expect the Biden administration to demand as it renegotiates the JCPOA?
Sorry, there was some problem with the line that you'll have to repeat.
Yeah, so what modifications could Biden add to the JCPOA?
Okay, I think I mentioned that in earlier remarks. What Israel expects more than anything else is more focus on surveillance over the possible military dimensions of the plan, the military aspect of the nuclear plan. It will expect the Biden administration to delay as much as possible the end of the agreement, sunset clause, and so on, in order to maintain this regime, to maintain the control over the Iranians as long as possible, in order to prevent them from reaching a nuclear weapon sometime in the future. And Israel would also expect the Biden administration to address two very crucial issues which were ignored by the Obama administration. One of them is stopping Iran from helping terrorist organizations and guerrilla organizations all over the region. And the second is focusing on surveillance of Iran's ballistic missile plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to note that I think during the Democratic primaries, most of the candidates said just clearly they will re-enter the Iran deal on day one of their presidency, kind of without any conditions. And there were a few candidates, I think Biden was one of them, Amy Klobuchar, another, maybe one or two more, who did talk about, getting back to the deal, but building on it and adding to it and emboldening it. And I think this is one of the reasons why Israel was relieved that Biden won the Democratic primary and not, let's say, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, especially on the Iranian front.
Absolutely right. I totally agree.
Yeah. Judy, another question. Do you think the administration will wait for Netanyahu or Abbas, or maybe both of them, to lose power before seriously investing in another Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, initiative?
I don't think it's obviously having Netanyahu and Abbas in power is not an ideal situation should they have wanted right away to relaunch negotiations. But I don't think that is the reason that they're not going to do it right away. They're going to wait now because they have so many more pressing issues to deal with. First of all, domestically, but even outside the United States, this is not a top priority. So this is just maybe more of an excuse to delay it even more.
You're saying between COVID, China, Iran, NATO, the economy, healthcare, Biden is not going to be busy shuttling between Ramallah and Jerusalem.
That's right.
Yeah, makes sense. Amos, this is a very peculiar question. I will see if you know what's our take on it. Could Israel reap any benefits from the situation between Armenia and Azerbaijan? The war, the peace agreement, does it have any implications for us?
Not directly. Israel has been accused of supporting Azerbaijan. It's rather evident that Israel was supplying weapons to the Azeris during the war. It has now been announced, I think yesterday, the Azeris have announced that they've actually won this, that they seem to have the upper hand. It's quite a peculiar conflict, quite a very regional, in that region. I don't think it has direct implications for Israel right now, but Israel is, it maintains diplomatic relationships with both sides, but it's closer to the Azeris than it is to the Armenians. And of course, everybody was involved there, the Iranians, the Russians, the Turks. It's quite an important conflict, but it has no direct implications to what's going on in Israel.
Thank you. Judy, a question about the normalization deals between Israel and the Arab countries in the Gulf, Sudan. Do we see any reason for the Biden administration to change course on this, to try to reverse it, or maybe the opposite, to continue and to maybe have one thing that they do take from the Trump administration and continue into their 4 years?
Well, I think Biden has already come out and welcomed these agreements. So certainly don't see him trying to roll anything back. But probably had Trump won the election, we would probably see some more of these agreements in the near future. And I guess now that he's not going to be president, it's going to take a bit longer until that happens. But I would assume it's just as much in Biden's interest to promote these peace agreements as it was in Trump's interests.
All right, we are getting close to the end of the hour, but we still have a lot of more questions coming in. One that just popped on my screen and I find interesting. Amos, this is for you. With Biden being the next president, what will be the impact on Israel's opportunities to act in Syria, to attack Hezbollah? Do you think it will narrow in any way?
I don't think so. Again, as you've mentioned, this is an ongoing relationship with Biden for 40 years. Between Netanyahu and Biden know each other for almost 40 years, and Biden has been in close contact with, I assume, every Israeli leader. Oh, he always mentions Golda Meir, but perhaps a bit later on than that. And even under the Obama administration, of course, there was a lot of tension when Netanyahu was discussing the possibility of an Israeli unilateral strike against Iran. But even then, we did not see an exact red light from Washington to Israel saying, "Do not attack at any cost." This wasn't the case. It's not going to be the case here when we talk about Syria and Lebanon. Iran is another issue. It was always more of a sensitive issue between Israel and the United States. But when it comes to Israel defending its immediate interest, dealing with Iranians in Syria or Hezbollah in Lebanon, I don't expect that the Biden administration's attitude to be very, very different than Trump's. Perhaps Trump took it one step further by actually saying to Netanyahu, "Do whatever you wish." And Netanyahu never dealt with Iran, but regarding Syria and Lebanon. But I don't see Biden making a much of a U-turn regarding that. I think we'll see more strikes if Israel finds this necessary.
Judy, we have a question about the Israeli ambassador in Washington, Ron Dermer. Is the end of the Trump era also the end of the Dermer era in Washington? And then another question about, do we have any clues about who will be Biden's ambassador to Israel?
So as for Ron Dermer, it's for sure he's leaving. And Gilad Erdan, who is already in New York, he's been appointed for dual roles. He will both be Israel's ambassador to the UN and Israel's ambassador to Washington, and he's about to take over. I think he is actually in Washington right now, and the handover is taking place.
There is a transition in the embassy, unlike in the White House.
Yes, yes. He also is a Likudnik, a political appointee, and he was a minister in the past government, but he's been there, I think already, he moved to New York, I guess, a month or two ago. So, so that's for sure. Dermer's coming back and he's being replaced by Erdan. And as for who might replace David Friedman, well, one of the names that has come up, and I don't know how much there is behind this, is Dan Shapiro, the former Obama.
Making a comeback for another term as
He's
ambassador?
Here. It's so easy. He's here.
Yeah.
He never left. So it would be very easy, the transition for sure. He was very well liked in Israel. He speaks fluent Hebrew. So that's one name that is definitely being floated.
Interesting. That would be...
it would be unprecedented, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever... Well, Martin Indyk had 2 terms as ambassador, but yeah,
this spent some time in the US in between.
Shapiro, yeah, this would be a very interesting choice. We are past the hour. I will just take 1 or 2 more questions since we still have a lot of people with us indicating that there is interest, and I can understand because Amos and Judy are saying really fascinating things. So a question to you, Amos. Again, this is something that is a bit speculative. Do we expect anything on the Pollard front before Trump leaves the White House? You know, this could be one last gift to Netanyahu, maybe?
I saw a piece by Yossi Melman, one of our colleagues, just a day before yesterday, bringing out that scenario. I have to admit, I didn't think of this as something that was in the cards right now. The question is, it could be a kind of a gesture. The question is, how important is this for Trump or for Netanyahu? It's true that among right-wingers in Israel, especially for some reason among settlers, Pollard has become a sort of a folk hero. So there are people who are taking an interest in his battle to be able to leave to Israel and so on. It doesn't seem to me as a very important issue right now. If Trump feels like it can probably do that. I don't think that, again, there was a lot of resentment among former US security officials and so on towards such an act. Right now, would Washington take note with everything else going on? Perhaps he will do that. But then again, would it serve Netanyahu? Would it be that important for Netanyahu? If we're not going into elections in Israel, if the elections are held in June, could Netanyahu use that as a card to persuade voters who might vote for Bennett to go to move?
Half a year later, probably not.
Yeah, probably not. It's not the most important thing in the world. Again, I think the most important gesture that Netanyahu can receive from Trump right now is vaccines, vaccines, and vaccines. It's more important than anything else.
So I want to end on that note and ask both of you a question, you know, kind of open-ended. From the Israeli perspective, you know, Biden, after he comes into the White House, what is more important? Any kind of gesture specifically aimed at Israel on diplomatic issues, or just a competent handling of COVID and trying to end that crisis? What would mean more for Israel in the current situation? Judy, I'll start with you.
I would say the latter.
Just because
that's what's on everybody's mind right now. That's our primary concern in America here. That's what everyone in the world cares about today.
Well, at least some people, you know, and I mean, I saw even today pictures from a political gathering, I think in Georgia, around the Senate race. There were basically, you know, half the people indoors are without masks, but it is true that for a lot of people, it's a priority. Amos, your take on this one?
Unsurprisingly, I agree with Judy. This is the #1 issue in the world. A pandemic, we haven't seen anything like this for more than 100 years. This is why people are suffering. I think the US especially is in for a rough patch between now and probably March and April. Although the vaccines are promised, it's quite clear that there's going to be a very, very hard winter there. And I'm afraid that there's something not at the same, not so gigantic, but something may happen here as well. This is what people are interested right now. If the United States can move forward and finally, after handling COVID so badly for a year, can move forward with vaccines, with better treatments, and so on. And if it can bring that kind of news to the world, this would be extremely important to everybody. And of course, Israel would love to take advantage of the so-called special relationship, because now it's really special and it's really urgent for us as well. And the US is leading the world, even considering all those, all this neglect from the White House. It's the United States technological and scientific community that is surging forwards dealing with the vaccine, and that's more important than anything else for everybody, I would assume.
All right, so we will end on that note. I want to thank you both, Amos and Judy, for a fascinating discussion. I want to thank all of our viewers and remind you, please, to subscribe to Haaretz.com to get writer alerts for Amos and Judy, so you can follow their stories and articles and read all the wonderful things that they write for us. And I would like to ask everyone to stay safe and to be well, and to join us soon for another Haaretz Zoom briefing. We will have more details, for the next one coming up. So thank you very much, and have a good evening or good night wherever you are.